I'm here now with Pierre Ferrari, who's the chairman of the board of Ben & Jerry's Homemade Inc. A lot of people don't know the whole name, do they? They only know Ben & Jerry's. Yeah. But that's the official name. So I'm going to ask Pierre to tell us when Ben & Jerry's was started and some of the other details of how it went public and those kinds of things, up until when the actual deal to sell to Unilever was beginning to be negotiated.
Okay. Ben & Jerry's started a small scoop shop in 1978 in a gas station, I guess, abandoned gas station. And they prepared ice cream that was not only very rich, but also with all sorts of inclusions. I think that was sort of their product strategy. That's what Ben liked to eat, so that's what Ben sold. They were quite successful, and they had a little wholesale business on the side, and it grew quite rapidly. And at some point, they were wanting to sell the business. There was some trauma around that. They finally saved the business for themselves. Jerry went off to continue his studies and do some other work. Ben stayed and began to grow the business, the wholesale side of the business, and quickly found that he needed capital. And he did not like or did not know any angel investors. He didn't like VCs. And he decided that he wanted to raise money from the community, the Vermont community. And against all odds, he actually sold stock in Vermont under Vermont corporate law, literally retail sales of stock. And there was some kind of provision in the sale of stock that the Vermont, you had to be a Vermont resident, that the Vermont resident could not sell this for a period of, I can't remember if it was 3 or 5 years, some period like that. And so he, against all odds, against all advice, he succeeded in raising a small amount of capital, built a plant to produce the ice cream, and grew very fast and outstripped supply, almost within 2 years. And suddenly the capital requirement moved from, capex of $5-6 million to suddenly they needed $40 million. And that's when they took the decision to go public, I mean really public, on the stock market. And that included, of course, investment bankers and the whole shebang. And of course, it was a decision that had implications, maybe 20 years later, because that occurred, I think, in '84. So the Vermont float was '82, then they went public in '84, and then they had another offering, I think, in '88, where they raised another $40-50 million as they built the plant up. So you had, and the whole, and I think it was Greg, or maybe it was Gary, that brought up who actually owns the stock. And at the time, of course, I mean, Ben felt protected when there was Vermont residents because he knew that everything he did was linked to the community. He was buying milk from local suppliers, small family farms, etc. And the whole aura of Ben & Jerry's was related to this Vermont community. As they went national, they still had a fairly high proportion of stockholders or shareholders that were linked to the values. There was sort of a linkage, although it's hard to tell. But that's a part of the story that we need to reprise later, in terms of who actually owned the stock and what interest did they have in the financial success of the company. So there was a company. It was publicly owned, stock market, and they had very fast growth. They had some turbulence in terms of management. They had a man called Chico Lager, who was actually with Jeff Furman, one of the founding four. He managed the company for a while. Then there was some divisions with Ben. They had other managers that were very strongly linked to the values, the mission, which weren't necessarily the best managers. And slowly but surely, the board began to shift the demand on Ben and on Jerry to professionalize the management. And that has its repercussions itself, which we can talk about. Late 90s, when actually the board had brought in very professional management, is when things began to unravel to some degree, not in terms of financial performance, but in terms of the set of incentives that existed. And suddenly, as a public company, we had another company approach us and make an offer, an unsolicited offer for the company. So maybe we stop the story here and turn it over to...
Well, before we do that...
Oh, maybe that. Let me ask some questions.
Let me ask you a couple questions. What was the main social face of Ben & Jerry's in the beginning? And what was the main things that they were most concerned about having be part of their socially responsible business?
Mostly it was small farms, small family farms. They wanted to buy the milk, the butterfat from small dairy farms. They wanted to protect the kind of bucolic nature of Vermont. They thought it was beautiful. It avoided the corporate farming systems. They felt that if they could hold on to the small family farms who had a genuine interest in the land, that would be the best way to preserve the land. I think that was their primary concern.
Mm-hmm. Well, but it became pretty obvious to me from afar that they began to shout their political views from the housetops pretty much.
You know, what they're best known about is, if you go back in history, is to look at the kind of equity they wanted within the company. They really wanted a democratic workplace. And most of you, if we did a piece of research here, I think you'd probably remember the salary ratio. You know, they began at 3-to-1, they went to 5-to-1, and then 7-to-1. It created it created a problem in hiring competent people if you couldn't really pay them enough. Plus, you had to live in Vermont, which is a beautiful place, but it's really far away from many other centers. So they began with a very, very tight salary ratio, which got them a tremendous amount of publicity because of this democratic workplace. And now the other parts of their the successful marketing and the visibility that they got was that they were aggressive in confronting corporate controls of distribution system or retail systems. The whole story with Pillsbury, I mean, is just an extraordinary story on how two little guys confronted a major American corporation over their practices to control the distribution system.
Well, wasn't that around shelf space to a great extent?
No, it was actually, Pillsbury was actually protecting or preventing Ben & Jerry's to be distributed by distributors. They were enforcing exclusive arrangements, and Ben & Jerry's couldn't get distribution. Just literally could not get in the stores. So they confronted it in the public. And the PR was so negative for Pillsbury. It was a brilliant move.
Yes, I think
so. It got the marketing and they got distribution. Nice job.
Okay. So the next stage is when I came into the picture. In the year 2000, when Dreyer's had this offer, and it was in the newspapers that Ben & Jerry's was about to be bought by Dreyer's. On a Monday morning, when I had cleared all my table to be able to start to write the book, which I'm still completing, I came into my office and I said, I'm going to call Ben and I have this idea I'd gotten in the hot tub the night before when some friends had come over. And so I called up Ben and I said, Ben, I don't know what your situation is, but I know that you're about to get bought by a company that you really don't want to get bought by. I knew Ben some from Social Venture Network. And I said, I think we should turn your situation from a liability to an asset. Let's set up a Berkshire Hathaway, and actually use those words, Randy. I said, why don't we set up a Berkshire Hathaway, a socially responsible Berkshire Hathaway, have Ben & Jerry's be the first company that gets bought, and let's raise capital from the social responsible investment market while this is all on the front pages of the newspapers, and then have it be bought by that company to do so. Ben said, it's too late. I said, what? He says, it's too late. On Thursday, 5 o'clock, there's going to be a board meeting, and the board has already decided that they have no choice but to sell it to Dreyer's. I said, but Ben, that can't be the case. I mean, we have between now and Thursday to stop it. We can't let that happen. Ben & Jerry's is the flagship of the social responsible community now, and we really need to be sure that we don't let that happen. He says, it's too late. It's all over. I said, I'm going to call my lawyer. We're going to figure out a way to stop it. One thing led to another. Judy Wicks and I called a bunch of people, and we got 25 of the leading social responsible investment personalities and leaders to become part of an investment group, sign powers of attorneys, give me the power to negotiate for the group. And then I put in an offer to the board by 5 o'clock that afternoon. Only I went to put the offer in 5 minutes before I had to have the offer into the board's legal firm. The investment banker that I'd arranged to do it called me up and said, we can't do it. The chairman of our board had met with Ben. He doesn't want to do the deal because he thinks there's going to be all kinds of problems with the negotiating of the deal. I said, well, I got 5 minutes to get this offer in. So I was on the board of a local investment banking firm called Meadowbrook Lane Capital, and Joe Sibilia was the person who was the chairman of it. As I was preparing stationery on my computer to send the offer in on another piece of stationery, I was on the phone with Joe Sibilia and said, guess what? You're buying Ben & Jerry's ice cream. And Joe said, yay, because I'd been talking to Joe because he was a really good help for me during all of this. So Joe Sibilia and I became part of the negotiation, and then we got the offer in by 5 o'clock. Then the board met with us, and which was wonderful because of those 25 people. the board, and you can say something to the board members about this if you like, decided that they had to respond to us. So then we ended up being able to be in negotiations, and that stopped the process. I see heads nodding. That stopped the process that we wanted to stop and Ben wanted to stop. So then what happened is that we ended up in negotiations with the board, and that lasted. There's so many stories I could tell there, but they're not appropriate for this moment. But the point was, we had VCs come in, we had VCs go out, and I am going to tell you one story. We had this VC who we had to, because we had to get this VC involved to raise the money, and they were already involved. So Ben and Jerry and I and my lawyers and my investment banking group, Joe and his team, would meet at this investment banker's office in Manhattan. And he kept on insisting on having a put and a call which would guarantee him a 25% return every year into the future. Well, obviously we weren't going to be able to agree to that, but I needed him, so I never said no to it, and we kept the negotiations going to get everything else in place. So then Unilever pulls me aside when we were at a meeting in Unilever's office, and the president of Unilever, Richard Goldstein, pulls me aside and says, Terry, you don't need that VC. We'll loan you the $200 million that allow you to begin to do this deal. I said, oh, that's very nice, Richard. Let's have that conversation. So I had the conversation with Richard. So then I was able to call up the VC. This is just an example of working with VCs. I was able to call up the VC. He says, you know about that put and call thing? Not going to work. I don't think we can have that be a part of the deal. So he says, well, you little person from Western Massachusetts, then you'll be out of the deal, and I'll be in the deal. How do you feel about that? I said, oh, okay. So I hung up the phone, but I made sure I was really nice with him because I never knew what else was going to happen. So I was out of the deal, and he figured I was out of the deal. So I said, okay. So then I went and we began a negotiation with Unilever. Another piece of the story is that something happened where the manager of Ben & Jerry's had a meeting, and as I was going to that meeting, I knew that manager, the CEO of Ben & Jerry's, was going to try to sabotage my deal with Unilever. So I called up the VC, and I said, listen, I got to talk to you because I might have to bring you back into the deal. He cussed and swore and everything at me. Says, you're just, you guys are crazy hippies. You don't know what the hell you're doing. You don't know business or anything. So I just listened for like 5 minutes. He shouted into the phone. So I then said, listen, what do you need to get back into this deal if I need you back in this deal? There was a pause. He said, I need Ben & Jerry to come to my office and sit in front of me and tell me they want me back in the deal. I said, I won't waste your time until I can deliver on that. He said, okay. We hung up the phone. Went up to the meeting. Sure enough, the CEO sabotaged the whole deal, and I needed the person back in, and Ben and Jerry and I were sitting in the green room or whatever that little room is, and it was like, oh my God, now we're at the whole end of the trail again. And I said, guess what, guys? I called up, and all you guys got to do is go down in the elevator, go over there, go up that elevator, go to him, sit and tell him you want him back in the deal, come back here, and we got him. Without a word, Ben looked at Jerry, Jerry looked at Ben, they went down the elevator, went over, went up, came back, says, okay, he's back in the deal. And this is how crazy some of these negotiations can be. It's so much, the relationships of different people in these kinds of things. So then what ended up happening is that we went through these long weeks of negotiations with Unilever, in Unilever's offices. And Ron, who's the senior vice president and the general counsel for Unilever USA and the Americas, is going to be up here in a minute and actually present what were the particulars of the deal. But let me just put in these last two pieces, which was that when we were in the negotiations with Unilever in their boardroom, when it finally came time, the board agreed to sell the company to us and to keep all the social agreements that we'd worked into the deal over those many, many weeks. Okay? So then we went and had a meeting with the board, and the board agreed to sell the company to my group. Wonderful news. So then we started to try to paper the transaction. Well, in these situations, you should try to get the transaction papered within 24 or 48 hours some time. Well, Ben and Richard Goldstein and everybody, the negotiations kept going on for days and days and days because we wanted to make sure we folded in all the social things that we wanted to be part of the deal. And it was lots of things that we wanted in the deal. The social metrics, as you'll hear. By that time, somebody, everybody can guess who, tipped off Nestle's. And Nestle's came in with a higher offer. So then our offer was at $38 a share. We had done all the numbers and knew that we could buy the company be able to make the payments to Unilever for the $200 million, and we had the other investors that could come in. Let me tell you, this hit the front page of the newspapers. We had the financial planner for Barbara Streisand call us, say, how many millions can I get into this deal? We had every ice cream distributor in the country call us up, and we got millions, we got 20 million, we got 20 million. The money just flowed as soon as it hit the front page of the newspapers. So we then, when the Nestle's put their offer in, their offer was, I think, at $42 a share. You know, it was higher, because Unilever already had an offer on the table for $40, which they weren't willing to take off until they'd worked out a deal with us if they were going to do so. So the deal we'd worked out with Unilever was that they were going to have a 35% ownership of the company, but if we had trouble making the payments in the $200 million, their percentage of ownership of the company would go up. Now, we knew that we were going to be stretching to be able to make those payments, and Unilever was gambling that we may have some problems making those payments, and of course they would love to have ended up with more than 50% ownership. When Nestle's came in, Nestle's through Dryers came in at $42 a share, the board, to my understanding, became clear that there was no way that the attorneys would decide this. Here's what I didn't tell you yet. We sat up until late at night with Skadden Arps, the attorneys for Unilever, and with Goldman Sachs investment bankers, and my investment bankers and my lawyers, trying to see if the board sold the company to my group at a $38 a share when there was a $40 share on the table, the minority shareholders we knew would sue. So therefore the question became, if they sue and we go to court, will we be able to win the case? We ended up concluding that at an only $2 difference, and because most of the shareholders were in Vermonters because of that first thing where there's all those Vermonter shareholders, that there would be this willingness of a judge perhaps to say, yes, it's okay to not have the financial interest of the shareholders be of paramount importance. It could be okay for you to sell the company at $38 a share because of this social reason. And our purpose was to establish in the courts that a social purpose could trump the financial interests of the shareholders being paramount. So that's why we all decided to go through with this thing.
Well, let's go back. I mean, because Ben and Jerry were very aware of the corporate law requiring that the fiduciary duty of the board was to maximize the return on shareholders. They obtained a passage of law in the state of Vermont that actually specifically established that the board of directors for corporations that were incorporated in the state of Vermont should and must take all of the stakeholders' interest at heart. That law was never tested in the courts, which I understand is an important thing. And the legal advice that the board got regarding that law was that it was unlikely to stand up. But they had thought about this, but they had not passed strong enough law, because it was known as the Ben and Jerry law. So unfortunately, right, we could not, because the argument that we were making, some of us on the board, was that we could be protected by that law, and by taking account the employees, the Vermont communities, the suppliers, we could probably withstand, actually not sell the company at all, or sell it to your group, which was much more likely to be socially responsible than what we thought were Unilever or Dryers.
That's right. So that's an important point, because that law was a part of what we thought might really help us be able to win in court. Okay? Right. So now I've said a little more than I wanted to say, but the point is that we ended up in a situation where the board decided to put basically the company on auction because they knew it was going to have to be sold. And so my group, Dryers and Unilever, were going to have to put an offer on the table, and then the board was going to sign whichever they thought was the best offer at that board meeting. And that's indeed what happened. And then, well, since I've gone this far, I'll tell you that this is a fun piece. So my group came back the next morning after a bunch of this stuff happened, and we knew that our deal was over, but nobody in our group wanted to admit it yet. So we went into the Unilever boardroom, and it's this historically preserved boardroom with Chinese kind of architecture and all these wonderful big tables and chairs and everything. So we admitted that it was over with. So Ben and me and my group, we took our hands to signal that it was over with. We put our hands on top of each other in the middle of the table, and we'd call it the hot fudge I forget, we called it the hot fudge deal is what we'd always called it. So we decided to let go. So we put our hands and we went, whoo, jumped up and threw our hands up in the air and let go of the deal. We knew we were out of the deal. All of the secretaries and all the people from Unilever offices came running into the boardroom. What happened? What happened? What happened? So we know, just being Ben & Jerry-ish. So then everybody starts to leave, and a secretary comes and says, Richard Goldstein, the head of Unilever USA, wants to talk to you and Ben. So Ben and I went back into the boardroom, sat down. Richard Goldstein, the head, came in, crossed his legs this way, crossed his legs that way, crossed his legs this way. He was like nervous and what's going on? And he says, Ben and Terry, we'd like you to be a part of our offer. We said, what? We were about to go home. We thought it was all over. Ben was going to go back to the board meeting. He says, we'd like you to be a part of our offer. So we will commit to keeping all of the social metrics and all the social agreements that we had agreed to these weeks we've been negotiating. We'd also agree to keep the board of directors in perpetuity. We'll also agree to give $5 million as a bonus to the employees, $5 million to the foundation, and $5 million, so Ben, you, and Terry can go set up a fund to start funding new socially responsible companies. And he said a few other things. Ben looked at me. I looked at Ben, said, sure. What that clearly signaled is how important it was to Unilever to end up with the ownership of Ben & Jerry's. And it was also clear to us at that time that Häagen-Dazs was the large super premium brand. Ben & Jerry's was the other large super premium brand. And there was this situation where it was really crucial for Unilever to end up having the other super premium brand. We had known that all along, but this signaled how really important it was to him. So then that was part of the offer, and they put it in. Now, if there's anything that I've said that is not totally accurate, the other board members or Ron will help round that out, just like Pierre just did.